There's a moment in every marriage where you learn who your spouse really is. For most people, it happens slowly, over birthdays, over arguments about money, over 1,000 small mornings. For Michael Carter, it happened in about 4 seconds. Standing in his own kitchen, holding an envelope his wife had told him, twice, never to open. Inside was a number, $340,000. Debt collectors don't send certified letters for anything less than serious. And the name on that letter wasn't a stranger's. It was his wife's, printed above a balance that didn't exist anywhere in the life he thought he was living. 9 years earlier, Michael had married a woman he believed came from money. Real money, family money, the kind of wealth that buys you out of ever having to worry. Everyone believed it. Her friends believed it. Even her own best friend believed it. For a while, back before she knew better than anyone how far the lie actually went. What Michael didn't know yet, standing there in his kitchen at 11 at night with the rain still coming down outside, was that the woman he married had been lying to him for almost a decade, in ways so small and so constant that no single one of them had ever felt, on its own, like a lie at all. And the person who would help him uncover the truth wasn't a lawyer, or a private investigator, or even his own family. It was her best friend, the same woman Michael would go on to marry 2 years later, for a reason that had almost nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with the one thing his first marriage never had: the truth. Stay with me, because the twist in this one isn't what you think, and it doesn't arrive where you'd expect it to. This is the story of 3 people: a man who built a life on a lie he didn't know he was living, a woman who spent a decade pretending to be someone she wasn't, and the best friend who saw the truth long before anyone else was willing to look at it directly. On the surface, this looks like a simple story. Man discovers wife's secret debt. Man falls for wife's best friend. Scandal, headline, done. But the real story is stranger than that, and it hinges on 3 questions that won't fully make sense until the very end. First, where did the lie about the family fortune actually begin? Because it wasn't Diane who invented it out of nothing. Somebody, somewhere, had told a version of that story long before she ever repeated it, and Diane had simply learned, over years, to wear it well. Second, Claire, the best friend, had suspected something was wrong for years, maybe longer than years. Why did she stay quiet through a wedding, through a house purchase, through nearly a decade of watching someone she loved dig herself deeper into a hole with no bottom? What exactly was she protecting, Diane? Or something in herself she wasn't ready to look at either? And third, the question in the title of this video. Everyone who eventually heard this story assumed the obvious thing: an affair, a betrayal, a man trading one woman for a younger, prettier version of the same fantasy. The truth is almost the exact opposite of that. And by the end, you may find yourself asking which of these 2 women you'd have trusted at that party 12 years ago, and whether you'd have been wrong too. Keep one detail in the back of your mind as we go. Everyone in this story, without exception, believed they knew exactly how much money everyone else had. Almost none of them were right, including, for a very long time, the 2 women at the center of it. To understand how a marriage built on a fortune that never existed collapsed, and how it led, strangely, to a second marriage built on nothing but honesty, we have to go back 12 years, to a rooftop bar in downtown Columbus, Ohio, on a night nobody involved remembers as anything special. At the time, Michael Carter was 29 years old, 3 years into running a small commercial construction outfit he'd built with a bank loan, a used pickup truck, and a lot of unpaid overtime. He wasn't rich. He wasn't trying to look rich. He was, by every account from people who knew him then, the kind of steady, unglamorous guy who shows up early and pays his own tab. To understand why honesty mattered so much to Michael, you have to know what happened to his own family when he was 16. His father had run a small hardware store for 20 years, until a business partner quietly took out loans against the store's name without telling anyone. Loans that came due all at once and buried the family in debt they never fully climbed out of. Michael watched his father lose the store, the good credit, and for a while, the marriage. He grew up believing the worst thing one person could do to another wasn't cruelty. It was hiding numbers from someone who trusted you with them. He'd told this story to exactly 2 people before Diane, his brother Dave, and a girlfriend in college who didn't last much longer after hearing it. When he told it to Diane, 3 months into dating, she cried, held his hand across the table, and told him she understood completely, which, at the time, felt like the deepest kind of intimacy 2 people could share. Looking back, Michael would say it was the first time Diane used his own history against him, without either of them realizing it. Diane Whitfield was different, or seemed to be. She had a way of telling stories about her family, the Whitfield furniture business, 3 generations, a name people in certain Ohio social circles still recognized, that made rooms lean in. She never bragged, exactly. She just let details slip, one at a time, like she wasn't even trying. A family lake house up near Sandusky, a grandmother's antique jewelry, appraised once just for the insurance, a trust that kicked in properly once she turned 30. Standing near the bar that night was Claire Bennett, Diane's best friend since their sophomore year of college. If you'd asked anyone at that party who the wealthy one was, they'd have pointed at Diane without hesitation. Almost nobody would have guessed the truth, that Claire, in her second-hand cardigan and off-brand sneakers, was the one who'd quietly inherited real money 2 years earlier, and had told almost no one, not even the man she was dating at the time. Claire's grandmother had left her a modest but genuine fortune, mostly in land and long-term investments that Claire barely touched. She drove a 12-year-old Honda with a crack in the windshield she kept meaning to fix. She worked a normal job at a housing nonprofit, helping first-time buyers understand mortgages they were terrified of. Money, to Claire, was something you didn't perform. Her grandmother had told her that exact phrase once, on a porch swing when Claire was 12 years old, a memory she'd carry, without fully understanding its weight, for another 20 years. It's worth saying clearly, here, near the beginning, Claire was not, at any point during this story, angling for Michael. During the years he dated and married Diane, Claire dated 3 different men, seriously enough to introduce them to her family. None of it worked out, for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone at that rooftop bar. This detail matters later, because it's easy, watching a story like this unfold from the outside, to assume the best friend was waiting in the wings the whole time. She wasn't. She was just paying closer attention than everyone else, for reasons she couldn't fully explain even to herself. Michael and Diane started dating 3 weeks after that party. He found her confidence magnetic, the way she moved through a room like nothing could touch her. She found his steadiness. A man who wasn't chasing her money. Refreshing, or so she said, more than once, in the early months. What Michael didn't know yet was that the Whitfield fortune hadn't belonged to Diane in any practical sense for almost 6 years. At 19, Diane had gone through a wild stretch. Bad investments a boyfriend talked her into, a maxed-out credit line co-signed by her father, and a small gambling habit she'd developed at a casino 2 hours from campus that had, for one ugly 6-month stretch, been anything but small. Her family had done what a lot of families do when a child burns through trust too fast. They didn't cut her off completely, but they locked what remained of her inheritance in a trust she couldn't touch until she turned 35, 9 years away when she met Michael, an eternity to a 26-year-old who'd already learned exactly how good she was at making people believe things. So the woman telling stories about lake houses and trust funds was, in reality, living on a marketing assistant's salary, a handful of credit cards, and a talent, inherited from nobody, entirely her own, for making people believe whatever she needed them to believe, delivered with just enough offhandedness that nobody thought to ask a follow-up question. Claire had known the real number since college. She'd been there for the casino trips, the frantic phone calls at 2 in the morning, the semester Diane nearly dropped out entirely. Claire didn't think Diane was a bad person. She thought Diane was scared and covering that fear with performance, the way some people cover a limp with a confident walk. And for years, Claire told herself that watching quietly was a form of loyalty, rather than a kind of silence with its own cost. When Michael finally met Diane's parents, 8 months into dating, the visit went exactly as Diane needed it to. Her father was polite, reserved, careful with his words, in a way Michael read as old money discretion, rather than what it actually was. A man quietly managing what was left of a story that had already stopped being true years earlier, and had no idea how far his daughter had carried it forward on her own. When Michael proposed 2 years later, on a Tuesday, at the restaurant where they'd had their first date, Claire was the maid of honor. She would tell people afterward that she almost said something to Michael the week of the wedding. Almost. She'd driven to his office once, sat in her car in the parking lot for 11 minutes, rehearsing a sentence she never used, and driven home again without going in. What stopped her wasn't loyalty to a lie. It was something closer to hope that maybe marriage, and a good man, would be the thing that finally made Diane stop performing and start being honest. Claire was wrong, and it would take 9 more years and 1 certified letter to prove exactly how wrong. It's worth noting that Diane didn't invent the habit of quiet financial rescue on her own. Her own mother had spent years smoothing over Diane's spending with small, undisclosed fixes, teaching her, without meaning to, that a gap in the story could always be patched later, as long as nobody looked too closely in the moment. By the time Diane met Michael, she'd had a decade of practice believing that. In year 2 of dating, the 4 of them, Michael, Diane, Claire, and whichever boyfriend Claire was seeing that year, had dinner together almost monthly. It was, by every account, a genuinely happy stretch for all of them, which is part of what makes the story hard to file away as simple villainy. Real friendship and real deception were running through the same years, at the same dinner table, without either one canceling the other out. Before Michael proposed, he did something that would look almost unbearably ironic in hindsight. He asked Claire, privately, over coffee, whether she thought Diane was truly happy, truly ready for a lifetime commitment. Claire told him yes. She has said since that it wasn't entirely a lie. Diane was happy, in the moments that counted at dinner tables and rooftop bars. She simply wasn't free, in the ways that would matter most 9 years later. It's worth noting that when Claire's grandmother died, it was Diane, more than anyone, who sat with Claire through the worst of it, driving her to the funeral home, picking out flowers, staying over for a week afterward so Claire wouldn't be alone. Whatever else this story turns out to be about, it isn't a story where either woman was only ever pretending to care about the other. There's a small detail worth mentioning here, one that only makes sense looking backward. When Claire's grandmother's original estate paperwork first came through, years before Diane and Michael ever met, a young Claire skimmed the cover letter, saw a number larger than she knew what to do with, and set the whole folder in a drawer for almost 2 years before properly opening it. Even the person who would later hold the missing piece of this story wasn't in any hurry to look closely at money either, just for very different reasons than her cousin. In the second year of dating, before any of this had a name, Michael's business nearly missed payroll after a client paid 90 days late. Diane sat up with him past midnight, going through the numbers on a legal pad, calm, practical, encouraging, the kind of partner he'd always pictured having. It's a strange detail to sit with now, knowing what the rest of the marriage would hide, that the very first financial crisis they weathered together, she handled with total honesty and real steadiness. Whatever came later, it didn't start as someone incapable of facing hard numbers. It started as someone who slowly stopped believing she was allowed to. Even the honeymoon carried a small, invisible thread of the pattern to come. The resort had cost nearly $9,000, booked, Michael believed, against Diane's trust distribution. In reality, it went onto a card that would still be carrying a balance from that same trip 6 years later. A single week of relaxation slowly compounding at 22% interest in the background of an otherwise happy marriage. The wedding itself cost $61,000. Michael's parents covered 8 of it. He assumed, reasonably, that the rest came easily from the Whitfield side. In reality, 11,000 of it went onto 3 different cards, quietly, in Diane's name, the first real bricks in a wall that would take 9 years to finish building, and 1 letter, on one rainy night, to finally knock down. At the reception, Michael's brother Dave gave a toast that got a laugh at the time and would sound very different in hindsight. Mike's never trusted anyone with money in his life except this woman. Guess that tells you something about her. Everyone raised a glass. Nobody in that room, including Dave, knew yet exactly what that trust would end up costing. The first 4 years of the marriage looked, from the outside, close to perfect. Michael's construction business grew steadily, picking up 2 commercial contracts that finally let him hire full-time instead of scrambling for subcontractors every winter. They bought a house in a good school district, even though they had no kids yet. Diane didn't work much after year 2. She said her trust distributions covered the fun stuff, and Michael, who trusted her completely, never once asked to see a bank statement. What Michael didn't see was the quieter architecture underneath the good life. A credit card opened in her maiden name, kept at her mother's old address so the statements would never arrive at the house. A loan from a friend of a friend that came with an interest rate that would make a payday lender blush. Small gaps. At first a car payment covered late, a vacation put half on a card Michael never saw the statement for, a Christmas gift from her parents that had actually come out of Diane's own overdraft. Diane got good at managing 2 versions of her life running in parallel. One version, the one Michael lived in, was calm, comfortable, and paid for. The other version involved phone calls in closets, minimum payments made 2 days before the cutoff, and a private mailbox at a shipping store 4 miles from the house. The kind of detail people only add when they're hiding mail from someone specific, and hoping that someone never thinks to ask why. There were near misses on the business side too, small enough at the time that Michael brushed past them. His partner Ron mentioned, once, that Diane had called the office asking whether Michael could take an early draw against next quarter's profits for a family thing. Michael assumed it was for a gift or a surprise, and never followed up. It was, in fact, a $4,000 payment toward a card 2 months past due. It happened again, almost the same way, a year and a half later, and again Michael let it go. Ron would say afterward that it never once occurred to him something was wrong, because Diane always sounded so entirely unbothered on the phone, the same easy tone she used for everything, whether she was planning a birthday party or quietly asking a man's business partner to move real money around behind his back. There were near misses socially, too, almost every year, small enough that nobody but Claire seemed to notice them. A dinner party question that landed a little too close. A moment at Diane's father's 60th birthday when a cousin mentioned, "After everything with the business," and Diane changed the subject so fast that Michael, for the first time, felt something flicker. A small, easily dismissed itch of confusion he chalked up to family politics he wasn't fully part of. The first real crack Michael actually noticed came in year 5. A dealership called about a car loan he didn't recognize, asking for Diane, using a last name, her mother's maiden name, that Michael had never heard her use in 9 years of dating and marriage combined. When he asked Diane about it that night, she had an answer ready almost before he finished the question. Something about a family business account, a technicality with her mother's estate. Nothing to worry about, said with the same easy confidence that had worked on every room she'd ever walked into. It was smooth, it was fast, and it worked. The way it had always worked, because Michael loved her. And loving someone means choosing, again and again, to believe them rather than the small, cold feeling in your stomach. 8 months later came a closer call still, one Michael never even learned about until Patricia's investigation surfaced it years afterward. A repossession company showed up for the very car in question. Diane paid the driver directly, in cash, standing on the curb in her bathrobe at 7 in the morning, and the truck left empty. Michael was at a job site 40 minutes away. He never knew it happened at all. There was exactly one real argument about money in 9 years of marriage, in year 6, when Michael, going through the mail, questioned a large purchase on what he thought was their shared card. Diane cried within about 90 seconds, said he was treating her like a suspect in her own home, and Michael, uncomfortable and guilty for having asked it all, apologized. It would be the last time he questioned a single receipt for almost 2 more years. Generosity became one of Diane's most effective covers, in a strange, backward way. She insisted on paying for group trips, picking up large dinner checks, covering a friend's rent for 1 bad month, gestures that read as the natural behavior of someone with money to spare. Nobody at that lake house that weekend imagined the treat would take Diane 4 months of minimum payments to fully absorb. Ron would later admit, during Patricia's interviews, that he'd had one genuine moment of doubt around year 7, watching Diane ask a slightly too specific question about how quickly a business distribution could be moved into a personal account. He didn't say anything at the time. He told himself it wasn't his marriage to worry about, a decision he'd revisit with real discomfort once the full picture came out. By year 8, the daily cost of keeping 2 lives synchronized had become almost a second job. Diane had learned to keep a mental ledger of due dates, the way some people track a calendar of birthdays, missing none of them, forgetting nothing, and telling absolutely no one, including, increasingly, herself, how unsustainable the whole structure had become. At Michael's company holiday party in year 7, Diane, mid-conversation with 2 subcontractors and their wives, mentioned offhand that the crew should come up to the lake place sometime that summer. There was no lake place. There never had been. Michael, 3 feet away talking business with someone else, heard the comment, smiled, and thought nothing of it, the way he'd thought nothing of 100 nearly identical comments across 9 years. Because by then the story had become furniture in his own mind too, familiar enough that it no longer registered as something that needed checking. It's worth pausing here, briefly, on what this was actually costing Diane, separate from what it would eventually cost everyone around her. Friends who knew her only casually during these years described someone who seemed to have everything handled. The version of Diane almost nobody saw sat on the bathroom floor some nights, doing math by phone light so the glow wouldn't wake Michael, calculating exactly how many days a given payment could slide before triggering a call to the house instead of her private mailbox. In year 7, Diane canceled on Michael's parents' 40th anniversary trip 2 days beforehand, citing a sudden work conflict that didn't exist. The real reason was smaller and more mundane than anyone would have guessed. A payment deadline fell in the middle of that trip, and she couldn't risk being somewhere without cell service and no way to make a call in private. Michael went alone, mildly disappointed, and never thought to connect it to anything larger. There was one moment, in year 8, where the two halves of this story nearly collided in a much more damaging way. Michael's construction business was expanding again. and he briefly considered adding Diane as a co-signer on a new equipment loan, simply for tax reasons his accountant had suggested. He decided against it at the last minute, for no reason he could later fully explain. A small, unremarkable decision that, in hindsight, kept his growing business entirely insulated from what was coming. In year 6, Diane took what she told Michael was a weekend trip to visit an old college friend. In reality, she spent 2 nights alone at a casino 3 states away, not chasing the reckless thrill of her 19-year-old self, but doing something closer to quiet, methodical math, trying, and mostly failing, to win back enough to close one specific gap before it grew large enough to notice. She came home $400 further behind than when she left, and told Michael the visit had been lovely. There was one moment, in year 4, that came closer to an actual confession than anyone besides Diane ever knew about. She sat Michael down at the kitchen table one evening, started a sentence, "There's something I should probably tell you about," and was interrupted almost immediately by a phone call from Michael's job site about a delayed concrete delivery. By the time the call ended, Diane had decided, quietly, that the moment had passed, and she never tried to reopen it. Looking back, the final year before the certified letter shows a quieter, more withdrawn Diane than the woman at the center of every earlier dinner party. She turned down 2 of Claire's invitations in a row, something that had never happened before in a decade of friendship. Claire noticed. She assumed, at the time, it was ordinary marriage fatigue, the kind every long relationship goes through, rather than a woman running out of road. For the next 3 years, the gaps got a little wider each time, and Diane got a little better at closing them fast enough that Michael never quite saw the whole shape of what was underneath. He would later describe it like living next to a slow leak in a roof. You patch the ceiling stain, you never check the attic, because the ceiling looks fine, and you have a business to run, and a wife who assures you everything is handled. Claire, meanwhile, watched all of it from the outside, with a knot in her stomach she couldn't quite name to anyone, including herself. She noticed the stories getting bigger. A family trip to Europe that Claire happened to know Diane's parents had never taken. An inheritance advance, mentioned once at a barbecue that made Claire's jaw tighten. She noticed Diane wincing, almost imperceptibly, whenever anyone mentioned the Whitfield Trust by name. Claire did try, once, in year 6, over coffee, carefully. She asked Diane point blank whether everything was okay financially. Diane laughed it off, then, 3 sentences later, asked Claire, with an edge Claire had never heard from her before, whether she was jealous. Claire never brought it up again directly, not because she believed the deflection, but because she recognized, in that one sharp sentence, exactly how much Diane needed the lie to survive. What almost nobody in Diane's life saw, not Michael, not even Claire, was what those nights actually looked like from Diane's side of the mattress. Hours spent doing mental math in the dark, moving small amounts between accounts to buy another 2 weeks, telling herself, the way she had for a decade, that next quarter would be different, that the trust would finally open in a few more years and quietly absorb everything before anyone had to know. The night before the torn envelope corner surfaced in the recycling bin, Michael and Diane spent a completely ordinary evening on the couch, half watching a show neither of them cared much about, her head on his shoulder the way it had rested there for years. It's the kind of detail that means nothing in the moment and everything in hindsight. The last quiet evening of a marriage that still believed, on one side of the couch at least, that it was exactly what it appeared to be. Then came the first letter. Not the certified one from the hook. An earlier one, smaller, easier to explain away. A notice from a collections agency for $9,000 on a card Michael had genuinely never seen in his life. Diane caught the mail that day before Michael did. She thought he found the torn corner in the recycling 2 days later, mixed in with pizza boxes and a flattened cereal carton. Just a scrap. Just enough to make him start Googling the agency's name, at 11 at night, while Diane slept upstairs, believing, as she had for 8 years, that whatever she couldn't control, she could still outrun it. That night was the first time in 9 years of marriage that Michael actually sat down and read every line of a bank statement instead of skimming the total. He didn't find much. Diane had been careful, and most of the real debt lived in accounts he had no legal way to see yet. But he found enough small oddities, enough transfers to accounts he didn't recognize, to know the torn scrap in the recycling bin wasn't a one-time mistake. It would take him 3 more months to find the full picture. 3 months of quietly gathering documents, quietly asking questions he already half knew the answers to, quietly rehearsing conversations he wasn't ready to have out loud yet. And when he finally did find the full picture, the person who helped him piece it together wasn't a lawyer. It was the one person who'd been quietly worried about Diane longer than anyone alive. What started as one Google search turned into a genuine investigation. Michael, methodical by nature, the same trait that had made his construction business succeed against bigger, better-funded competitors, started pulling every financial document he could legally access. Joint account statements going back 5 years, old tax filings, the title history on their house, anything with both their names on it. By month 2, feeling like an amateur trying to solve something that needed a professional, he hired a forensic accountant, a quiet, unglamorous woman named Patricia Kowalski, who specialized in exactly this kind of unraveling, the financial equivalent of an archaeologist, brushing dirt off one bone at a time until the whole skeleton is visible. Patricia had built her whole career on stories like this one, though she'd never quite say it that plainly to a client. Most people don't lie with one big number, she told Michael in their first meeting. They lie with 100 small ones and hope nobody adds them up. What she found, layer by layer, over the following weeks, was not one secret debt. It was a structure, 3 credit cards under variations of Diane's name, a personal loan from an online lender at 19% interest, and a consulting fee arrangement with a friend of Diane's from her old marketing job that turned out, on closer inspection, to be an unregistered loan with no consulting ever performed. Patricia's method was slower and less glamorous than anything Michael had imagined from movies about this kind of work. She cross-referenced dates of deposits against dates of known expenses, built a month-by-month cash flow model, and flagged every transaction that didn't have an obvious source. It took her associate nearly 3 weeks just to confirm which of the 4 Diane-linked mailing addresses were active, and which were decoys left over from earlier, smaller schemes years before. By the 6th week, Patricia had built what she called, only half joking, the whole ugly map, a single timeline stretching the full length of a conference room wall, showing every card opened, every balance transferred to hide a rising interest rate. Every month, Diane had managed to stay exactly 1 step ahead of a default. Michael has said he could point to the week on that wall, when he stopped feeling angry and started feeling something closer to exhausted grief, simply from seeing 9 years condensed into a single strip of paper. Following Patricia's guidance, Michael began contacting each creditor directly, not to pay anything yet, but to confirm account ownership and establish, in writing, that the debts were solely Diane's, opened without his signature or knowledge. It was tedious, unglamorous work, an hour or more per call, and it built the paper foundation his divorce attorney would later rely on almost entirely. Michael waited nearly 2 months into the investigation before telling his own parents anything. When he finally did, sitting at their kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, his father, the same man who'd lost the hardware store decades earlier, went quiet for a long moment, before saying only, "I know exactly what that feels like, and I'm sorry you have to learn it too." It was the most either of them had spoken about the old business collapse in over a decade. By the time Michael brought everything to a divorce attorney, the binder Patricia and Michael had assembled together ran past 200 pages, statements, call logs, confirmed account ownership letters, and a full month-by-month reconstruction of 9 years of quiet borrowing. The attorney would later say it was one of the most thoroughly documented cases of undisclosed personal debt he'd handled in 20 years of practice, built almost entirely by the husband himself, one patient evening at a time. The number climbed as the investigation went on, and it climbed fast, in a way that made Michael physically sick the first time he saw the running total on Patricia's laptop screen. By the time she finished her first full pass, the figure sitting behind Diane's carefully maintained life had reached $340,000, the exact number that would arrive, weeks later, in that certified letter, the one Diane had told him, twice, not to open. Michael did something at this point that surprised even him. He didn't call a divorce lawyer first. He didn't call his own parents, or his brother, or anyone from his side of the family. He called Claire, at nearly midnight on a Thursday, because some part of him already knew, without being able to say why, that she was the one person who wouldn't act surprised. Claire had spent 9 years half expecting this call, and dreading it in equal measure. When it finally came, she didn't ask, "What do you mean?" or "Are you sure?" That, more than anything, told Michael how long this had actually been going on, and how alone he'd been the entire time, without ever knowing it. For a while, Michael's investigation chased the wrong thread entirely. He assumed, reasonably, that Diane's family was quietly bailing her out year after year, that the trust everyone talked about was real, just badly mismanaged. He even drove 3 hours to confront Diane's father directly, half expecting to walk into an actual argument about family money he had some claim to. What Michael found at that house dismantled the entire fortune story in about 90 seconds. Diane's father wasn't sitting on a furniture empire. He'd sold the last of the family business 11 years earlier, and what remained after debts and a divorce settlement of his own was, by his own quiet, embarrassed words, enough to be comfortable, not enough to brag about. He hadn't funded a single one of Diane's debts, and by the end of that porch conversation, he looked, Michael would say later, more relieved than ashamed, like a man finally allowed to stop carrying a secret alone. For a brief, uglier stretch, Michael also wondered whether the secrecy was covering something else entirely. An affair, hidden feelings, a second life that had nothing to do with money at all. He hired a second investigator briefly, purely to rule this out. What came back was almost a relief in its own strange way. No affair, no second life. Just debt, quietly compounding, month after month, for 9 straight years, alone. Diane's mother, Susan, when Michael eventually spoke with her too, offered the one piece of context nobody else in the family wanted to give plainly. She's been performing being fine since she was 19 years old. I thought marrying you would be the thing that let her stop. It was the first time anyone in Diane's family said out loud that they'd known something was wrong. For an even briefer, more uncomfortable stretch, Michael wondered whether Claire herself had been quietly funding Diane's lifestyle, whether the two women had some arrangement he didn't understand. It was Patricia's paperwork that finally cleared that up. 2 small loans years apart, both fully repaid, nothing since, and no transfers of any size between the two women's accounts in over 5 years. What actually emerged, once the red herrings were cleared away one by one, was simpler and harder to hear than any affair or family conspiracy would have been. Diane hadn't been rescued by anyone. She'd been running the gap between the woman she pretended to be and the paycheck she actually earned, for almost a decade, entirely on her own, alone in a way that made the lie almost more sad than infuriating. There was one final false lead before the full picture settled. A recurring $78 monthly charge, unexplained for weeks, briefly convinced Michael that Diane might be maintaining a property or a second apartment somewhere he didn't know about. Patricia traced it in an afternoon. It was a storage unit, 40 minutes away, holding nothing more dramatic than boxes of unworn designer clothes Diane had bought over the years, and never found occasion, or nerve, to bring home. When Patricia's final report was complete, bound and printed, running to 60-some pages of tables and summaries, Michael read the entire thing in one sitting, back at the same kitchen table where he'd first torn open the certified letter months earlier. He would say later that the strangest part wasn't any single number. It was reaching the last page and realizing there was no final twist waiting in the data itself. No secret he could still discover that would make any of it easier to carry. Just 9 years, laid out in full, waiting for him to decide what came next. The investigation months weren't calm ones for Michael, whatever his methodical exterior suggested to the people around him. He's admitted since, to one moment alone in his truck in a job site parking lot where he hit the steering wheel hard enough to bruise his palm, then sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes, before driving home to a wife who still, at that point, had no idea how much he already knew. The mediation sessions that followed were, by the account of both attorneys involved, unusually quick. Diane contested almost nothing, not the separation of business assets, not the division of the house equity, not even the timeline. Her own attorney later told a colleague it was the least combative divorce he'd handled in years, less a legal battle than a woman quietly accepting the bill for a decade she'd already, in her own mind, spent years bracing for. Patricia has said this case has stuck with her longer than most, not because the debt was unusually large by the standards of her work, she's seen far bigger, but because of how ordinary the underlying story turned out to be. Most people who do this, she told Michael near the end, aren't con artists. They're just people who told one small lie at a very young age and never found a safe enough moment to take it back. The confrontation didn't come all at once. It built over 2 more weeks, culminating on a Sunday afternoon when a collector called the actual house line, a mistake on their part, or maybe simply the debt had finally outgrown Diane's ability to keep every channel private. Michael stood in the doorway and listened to his wife's voice change entirely, sliding into a practiced, placating tone he'd never once heard her use with him. That night's dinner, when it finally came, didn't look like the movies. There was no screaming, no thrown plates. Diane, by every account of that evening, went quiet in a way Michael had never seen in 9 years of marriage. The performance, for the first time, simply had nowhere left to go, and she seemed almost relieved to stop holding it up. She told him almost everything that night, in pieces, stopping twice to cry and once to apologize in a way that felt, Michael would say later, more like grief for herself than genuine remorse toward him. About the trust she couldn't touch until 35. About the gambling at 19 that had put her there in the first place. About how easy it had been, at first, to let people assume the fortune was hers to spend, and how impossible it had become, years later, to ever correct them without unraveling everything at once. Michael asked her one question that night that neither of them has ever fully answered the same way since. Whether she'd ever once considered simply telling him the truth, early, before the number got this large. Diane's answer, after a long silence, was that she'd tried, twice, in the 2nd and 5th years of the marriage, and both times had convinced herself, watching how happy he seemed, that the kinder thing was to keep protecting a version of their life he still believed in completely. Michael didn't sleep that night. He sat outside on the porch steps until nearly 4 in the morning, running the same math over and over. 9 years, $340,000, and a version of his own life he could no longer fully trust as real. Even the good parts, even the parts that had genuinely been happy. It would have been a clean enough story right there. A marriage broken by money and lies. A wife who dug herself a hole she couldn't climb out of. A husband who finally saw the truth and walked away. But there was one more piece Michael hadn't found yet, sitting quietly in a filing cabinet 3 states away, that would change how everyone understood what actually happened. And it wasn't about Diane at all. In the process of tracing the collapsed Whitfield family finances back to their source, Patricia had pulled the estate records of Diane's late grandmother, the same grandmother whose lake house and antique jewelry had anchored years of Diane's stories. What Patricia found in that estate file was the piece nobody had been looking for. The grandmother's estate hadn't been small at all. It had been worth just over $2 million at the time of her death, 17 years earlier, but almost none of it had gone to Diane, or even to Diane's father, who received only a modest fixed sum. The bulk of it, roughly $1.2 million in land, investment accounts, and a small commercial property, had gone, 19 years earlier, to a young woman named Claire Bennett. It turned out Claire and Diane weren't just college roommates who'd stayed close for over a decade by coincidence. They were second cousins, distantly connected through a branch of the family neither of them advertised, related closely enough to have grown up at the same holiday gatherings as small children, before Claire's side of the family drifted, quietly and without any real feud, toward the edges of the extended family tree. Diane's grandmother, who was also, more distantly, Claire's, had watched Diane's spending spiral even as a young teenager, years before the casino trips that would come later. She'd watched Claire, from childhood, save birthday money in a shoebox, and ask careful, unglamorous questions about how a savings account actually worked. When she wrote her final will, 2 years before her death, she made a decision she never fully explained to either young woman while she was alive. She left the real money to the cousin who wouldn't need to perform having it. There was one more document in that folder, a short, handwritten letter the grandmother had left sealed alongside the will, addressed only to Claire, never opened until Patricia's search surfaced it through the estate attorney 19 years after it was written. In it, the grandmother explained, in careful, apologetic handwriting, that she wasn't punishing Diane. She was protecting her from an amount of money she believed, correctly, would only make an already fragile habit worse. The letter asked Claire to do one specific thing, if she ever learned the full story, to never volunteer the exact number to Diane herself. The grandmother believed, even from beyond the will, that some truths do more damage delivered all at once than they do staying quiet, and she was trusting the more careful granddaughter to make that judgment call when the time came. Claire had known the broad strokes for years, that she'd inherited more than Diane had, that there'd been some family reasoning behind it she'd never fully understood and had, out of some mixture of guilt and discomfort, never gone looking for. What she hadn't realized, until Patricia's records made it unavoidable, was that her quiet, modest-seeming inheritance was very nearly the exact fortune Diane had spent a decade pretending to already own. For Claire, this wasn't triumphant. It landed like grief. She'd spent years watching her closest friend construct an entire identity around a fortune that, in some very real sense, actually existed in the family, just not in Diane's hands, and never going to be, no matter how convincingly she told the story. Patricia's research eventually traced the full split back 3 generations, to a disagreement between 2 sisters over the family furniture business that neither Diane nor Claire had ever heard the details of growing up. The 2 branches of the family had drifted apart slowly, over decades, until only the grandmother herself still moved comfortably between both sides, quietly watching 2 great-granddaughters grow into very different relationships with money, and making, in the end, a decision neither of them saw coming. For Michael, the discovery reframed 9 years of marriage in a single afternoon. Diane hadn't been lying about a fortune that never existed anywhere. She'd been lying about which side of the family actually held it, telling a version of the truth twisted just enough to put herself, instead of her cousin, at the center of a story that had, all along, belonged to someone else. The attorney was careful to point out that none of this changed the legal facts of the case. The debt was still real. The divorce would still proceed the same way. But for two people sitting in that office that afternoon, the emotional shape of the entire story had just quietly rearranged itself. The estate attorney, still practicing decades later, remembered the grandmother well. He told Michael and Patricia that she'd come in twice in her last 2 years of life, revising the letter's wording each time, unable to settle on language that felt kind rather than cruel. She wasn't trying to punish anyone, he said. She kept saying she was trying to protect two granddaughters from two very different problems, at the same time, with the same piece of paper. Claire agonized for nearly a week over whether to tell Diane any of it directly. In the end, she honored the letter she'd never known existed until that point and said nothing. It's a decision she still isn't entirely sure was the right one, even years later. Claire has said, in the years since, that the hardest sentence in that letter wasn't the instruction to stay quiet. It was a single line near the end, where her grandmother wrote that she hoped, more than anything, that Claire would never have to be the one to explain any of this to Diane at all, that time and honesty might simply resolve it first. Time did not resolve it first. A certified letter on a rainy night did. Diane did eventually learn a version of the inheritance story, though not from Claire, and not directly from Michael. Her mother told her a partial account 2 years after the divorce, during one of those newly honest phone calls. By every account, Diane simply went quiet for a long moment, then said, "That actually makes more sense than anything else in this whole mess," and let the subject drop. It was, several people close to her have said, one of the first times in years she didn't feel any need to turn a hard truth into a story. It's the kind of twist that changes how you watch everything that came before it. Diane wasn't simply an imposter performing a fantasy from nothing. She was a woman standing one generation, one branch, and one grandmother's careful, painful judgment away from the exact life she'd spent a decade performing. Close enough to see it clearly, too far to ever actually touch it. The divorce took just under a year to finalize. Ohio courts don't treat undisclosed personal debt as automatically shared property, and Patricia's forensic work made it possible for Michael to legally separate his construction business and personal savings from the debt Diane had built alone, over nearly a decade, largely without his knowledge or signature. No criminal charges were ever filed. What Diane had done was deceptive and financially devastating to her own life far more than anyone else's, but not, in the end, illegal in the way outright bank fraud would have been. Two creditors won civil judgments against her directly. She kept the house, heavily mortgaged, and by all accounts is still, years later, paying those judgments off on a marketing salary that finally, quietly, matches the life she actually lives. The civil hearing itself lasted less than 40 minutes. Diane didn't contest either judgment. She sat through both hearings alone, without her parents, without Claire, taking notes on a legal pad like a woman determined, for the first time, to fully understand the numbers she'd spent a decade avoiding. Susan says the biggest change in her daughter wasn't the therapy appointments or the support group, exactly. It was smaller than that. Diane started calling just to talk, without an ask hidden somewhere in the conversation, without a story that needed maintaining. It took 31 years, Susan said, but I finally feel like I know who I'm talking to. 4 years after the divorce, Diane has paid down roughly $60,000 of the 2 civil judgments against her, slowly, on a marketing salary, without help from anyone. At that pace, she'll finish paying what remains sometime in her late 40s, a fact she's mentioned to her support group, by her own account, without a hint of the old performance, just as a plain number she's finally decided to live inside of honestly. On their first anniversary, Claire did something that became a small, half-serious tradition between them. She printed out their joint bank statement and set it on the dinner table, unprompted, before either of them had said a word about money all evening. "Just so you never have to wonder," she told him. Michael has said it's become his favorite tradition of either marriage, not because the numbers are exciting, but because nobody ever has to ask. Word of the marriage traveled slowly through the wider, scattered Whitfield family in the months afterward, reaching cousins on Claire's side who barely remembered Diane and had never met Michael at all. More than one distant relative reached out simply to say how strange and oddly fitting it felt that the two branches of that old, quiet family split had ended up tangled back together, 2 generations later, over something as unglamorous as a certified letter and a spreadsheet. Claire still speaks with Susan every few months. A small, quiet loyalty that has nothing to do with Michael and everything to do with the 20 years the two families spent tangled together before any of this happened. She hasn't spoken to Diane directly since the year of the divorce. She said, more than once, that she hopes that changes eventually. She's also said she understands, completely, if it never does. Michael and Claire are now, quietly, talking about starting a family. Something Michael says he never once seriously discussed during 9 years with Diane. Always aware, on some level he couldn't fully name at the time, that there was a version of their finances he didn't want a child inheriting sight unseen. It's a small detail, mentioned almost in passing, that says as much about what changed in him as anything else in this entire story. To her credit, in the years since, Diane has made changes that nobody in this story, including Claire, expected quite so fully. She started therapy 8 months after the divorce. She got a better job, one she actually qualifies for on paper instead of performing her way into. Friends who've stayed close to her describe someone quieter now, less inclined to fill a silence with a story that isn't true. She started attending a support group for compulsive spending a year after the divorce, something she'd have laughed off a decade earlier as beneath her. People who know her now describe someone who still, occasionally, catches herself starting to embellish a story, and stops, out loud, mid-sentence, and corrects it. It isn't a redemption arc with a clean ending. It's slower than that, and more human than that, and by most accounts still ongoing. Michael and Claire didn't start dating right away. For almost 2 years, their relationship was something closer to two people who'd survived the same fire, checking in on each other from a careful distance neither one wanted to name out loud. Claire, by her own account later, was terrified of becoming the other woman in a story that was already messy enough without her. What changed things wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was the accumulation of small ones. The fact that Claire never once, in 2 years, tried to impress Michael with anything. She talked about money, when it came up at all, plainly, without performance, without ever needing him to be dazzled by it. One evening, about a year and a half into their careful friendship, Michael came by to help fix a leaking faucet at Claire's apartment, a small favor between friends. They ended up soaked, sitting on her kitchen floor laughing at how badly he'd botched it before finally getting it right. And Michael would later describe that unremarkable, slightly ridiculous evening as the moment the friendship first felt like something else, even though neither of them said a word about it for another 4 months. Claire's own journal from that period, portions of which she's shared with close friends since, shows a woman working hard to talk herself out of feelings she considered inconvenient at best and disloyal at worst. One entry simply reads, "I am not going to be the reason anyone tells this story wrong." She would spend several more months making sure that if anything happened between her and Michael, it happened slowly enough that nobody, including her, could ever call it sudden. Michael's own family wasn't immediately sure what to make of it. His brother Dave asked him directly, over beers, whether jumping from one woman in that friendship to the other was really a good idea. Michael's answer, according to Dave, was simple. "I'm not choosing Claire instead of Diane. I'm choosing honesty instead of a performance. Claire just happens to be the one who's never once given me a reason to check." Michael would later say the moment he knew he wanted to marry Claire wasn't a romantic one at all. It was an ordinary Tuesday, over a fast food lunch, when she casually mentioned her actual net worth almost apologetically, the way some people admit to a minor embarrassment. And it was, without exaggeration, the single most honest conversation about money he'd had in over a decade of adult life. When Michael proposed, there was no elaborate performance, no restaurant applause. He asked Claire plainly, sitting on her own worn-out couch, whether she'd be willing to build a marriage where nobody had to pretend to be anything, including rich, including poor, including fine when they weren't. She said yes before he finished the sentence, and cried harder at that than she had at any point during the entire investigation. Their wedding cost $11,000, paid for in full, in cash, 6 weeks in advance. It was smaller than Michael's first one by every measure that used to matter to him. Smaller venue, smaller guest list, no designer dress with a hidden interest rate behind it. It was also, by his own account, the first wedding day of his life where every single detail in front of him was completely, boringly, gloriously true. Michael's father, the same man who'd lost the hardware store decades earlier, gave the toast this time instead of Dave. He kept it short. "Took my son a while to learn that the quiet ones are usually the ones telling the truth. Glad he finally figured it out." It got a smaller laugh than Dave's toast at the first wedding had. It also, everyone in that backyard agreed, meant a great deal more. 31 guests came to that backyard wedding, including Ron the business partner, Patricia the accountant, and Diane's own mother Susan, who asked Claire directly, months earlier, whether it would be all right for her to attend, even though her daughter wasn't. Claire said yes without hesitation. It was, several guests said afterward, one of the few moments all day that made the whole yard go quiet. Diane wasn't at the wedding. Nobody expected her to be. She did send a card, months later, that Claire has never fully described the contents of to anyone outside her own household, only that it made her cry, and that she kept it, tucked into a drawer she doesn't open often. So here's the reason behind the title of this video. Michael Carter didn't marry his wife's best friend for money, or for scandal, or because she was somehow more glamorous than the woman he'd left. He married her for the one thing his first marriage never had, not even for a single day of those 9 years. A version of the truth he didn't have to go digging for. Diane's story isn't really a villain story either, even though it's easy to watch it that way from the outside. It's a story about what happens when the gap between who you are and who you're expected to be gets a little too wide to close honestly, and how long a person can run on borrowed identity before the interest, in every sense of that word, finally comes due. Today, Michael's construction business has grown to 11 employees. Claire still works at the same housing nonprofit, in the same 12-year-old Honda, now with 200,000 more miles on it than the night she and Michael first reconnected. And Diane, still slowly learning to tell the truth about smaller and smaller things, one honest sentence at a time. 2 wedding photos exist in this story. One hung, for 9 years, in a house built on a fortune that was never actually there. The other hangs today in a much smaller house, built on nothing more dramatic than 2 people who decided, after everything, that the truth was worth more than the performance of it ever could be. There's a version of this story where Diane is simply the villain and Michael is simply the victim, and it would be an easier video to make. But sit with the whole shape of it for a second. A grandmother's quiet, painful decision about which granddaughter could handle money, a woman who spent a decade trying to become worthy, in her own mind, of a fortune that was never technically hers to claim, a best friend who carried a secret she didn't fully understand herself for 19 years, and a husband who had to lose one marriage entirely before he learned what he actually needed from the next one. Which brings us to the question worth sitting with after everything you've just watched. Diane's version of the truth ran for 9 years, past a husband, past dozens of friends, past nearly everyone except one woman who'd watched it start back in a college dorm room. If you'd been at that rooftop bar 12 years ago, watching a confident woman tell easy stories about a family fortune, would you have believed her? And more importantly, would you have noticed the quiet one standing a few feet away, who actually had the money, and never once thought to mention it? Tell me in the comments what stood out to you most. The fortune that never existed in the hands everyone assumed, the cousin who quietly inherited it instead, or the man who chose plain honesty over glamour the second time around. If stories like this one get under your skin the way they get under mine, stay subscribed, because the next one starts with a woman who vanished for 11 years and came back to a funeral that was supposed to be her own.